Good afternoon, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's public event series, Too Much Information. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the IHC Director. As the public face of the humanities for the campus, the center runs programs, including this series, that draw upon the expertise, practice, and skills associated with the humanities to support scholars in the production of new knowledge and empower community members as agents of social change. Our series, Too Much Information, has been exploring the impact and the implications of living in the information age, as well as questions of access to and suppression of knowledge in the public sphere. On March 2nd, we will have an online talk about critical race theory and the recent assault on the theory in the United States. I hope you will be able to register for and attend this event as well. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to make sure you are aware of the question and answer function on your screen. You can submit questions to our speaker at any time during the event, and when our speaker concludes her presentation, we will pose as many of your questions as possible to her. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. Now to today's event, which is co-sponsored by the E. Day Leviton Endowment. We are delighted and fortunate to have Heather Hauser with us today. She is the Mody C. Boatright Regents Professor in American and English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. Her books include Infowhelm, Environmental Art and Literature in an Age of Data, and Ecosickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction, Environment, and Affect, which won the 2015 Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present Book Prize. It was also shortlisted for the 2014 British Society for Literature and Science Book Prize. Heather Hauser's other writings have appeared in numerous academic journals and in media outlets such as the New York Review Daily, Avidly, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And as I said, we are so happy to have Heather with us today to speak on the Climate Infowhelm.
Thank you very much, Susan and Aaron and Paula and Chris, who also facilitated my visit virtually today. It's been an honor to work with you so far, and I'm happy to share some insights from Infowhelm as they pertain to your theme of TMI, or too much information. I'm going to share my screen now, and also you will get in the chat a link to accessibility copies of the presentation. The talk I don't have accessibility copies of simply because they're in a bit of a note form, but please avail yourselves of either the PDF or the PowerPoint that's in this link. So minutes ago, you might have been checking feeds on your phone. Hopefully you were just scrolling and not doom scrolling to pass the time or to procrastinate, or even so as not to feel so alone. And there might have been a headline somewhat like this one, or it might have been something related to climate change that popped up on your screen. This might have registered consciously. It might have registered more somatically by elevating your heart rate or making you shake your head in disbelief. It might not have registered at all. But regardless, if you had clicked on the link, if you had pursued the content behind the headline, data likely would have larded the article. We've approached climate change as a numbers problem since it was first identified as a problem. And this is not the first instance of it being identified as a problem, but Bill McKibben's writing in 2012 on global warming's terrifying new math really cemented the quantitative logic for the public. So his big numbers at that point were 2 degrees Celsius, 565 gigatons, 2,795 gigatons. His new campaign has 2 numerical taglines, and that's the image on the right. One is a date, so that's what 32123 exclamation point refers to. On March 21st of this year, there will be worldwide actions to move money out of banks that are really buttressing fossil fuel infrastructure and deforestation. Now, the second number is a dollar amount that does trigger these actions. So in this Substack article, McKibben writes, quote, "This year's report from Bank Forward and its partners shows that if you have $125,000 in the mainstream banking system, it's producing more carbon than all the heating, cooling, driving, flying, and cooking in the average American life." So even as we have more in-depth journalism, memoir, and early oral histories of climate impacts, the crisis has been and really remains overwhelmingly and often necessarily data-centric. Now, my book, Infowhelm, which Susan mentioned in the intro, was really inspired by the data deluge of daily discourse, but more so by its expression in literature and other media. So Infowhelm appeared with Columbia University Press in June of 2020, and this was certainly a moment when information overload and the pain and violence it can register was too much with us. So obviously it was a COVID-19 pandemic, the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter uprisings and protests, and so much besides, right? Economic instability and the rest. So I want to give a brief overview of Infowhelm really as a basis for thinking about the interconnections between climate data and climate emotions. And this is a nexus I am, and definitely with some embarrassment, calling the CLI TMI. I'm not suggesting we all run off and use that phrase, but this riffing off of both the title of this lecture series at IHC, but also riffing off of cli-fi, which designates climate fiction. And I'm going to return to that genre a bit later in my remarks. So after an overview of Infowhelm, the concept in the book, I'll address how data has become atmospheric in recent fiction. I connect this climate atmospherics to habits in environmental writing that can turn crisis into inevitability. So climate atmospherics, they risk diffusing while also amplifying the feelings of crisis. I'll then examine or want to think about with you all, if possible, some of the responsibility humanists and artists hold for creating the CLI TMI. And I hope this will generate conversation not only today, but hopefully throughout the IHC series on too much information. That's a conversation about the relationship between analysis, contextualization, and production of too much information. So what is Infowhelm? We need data, obviously, but we know that data don't tell the whole story. They can also, as Catherine McKittrick writes, quote, "evacuate life from blackness," unquote, and other forms of being. Data can drive exploitation and cultural indifference. In confronting the necessity yet potential injustices of data, environmental art takes it up. That is, scientific information really becomes the raw material for artistic expression and exploration. So data certainly has it becomes an aesthetic resource. And this is really a common place that we see each other in, through, and as data. But Infowhelm as a concept is meant to capture that it isn't simply about TMI or about information overload, though that is certainly a central component. This, the concept of Infowhelm for me includes a cocktail of emotions that might include confusion, agitation, despair, or even what writer Reef Larson called infogasm in an article from 2012. So this is some of the mess of data deluge, building off of that first quote from today's Guardian. And I show how managing data is a way of managing emotions by analyzing media that take up these headlines and this data. Media like Maya Lin's online memorial, What is Missing, or Brian James's interactive website on species lost in pieces. These works, as with all of those in the book, and there are about, I would say, 20 or so works of literature and visual media that I look at in Infowhelm. These works aren't just humanizing the data, which is a phrase you'll hear a lot if you work with policymakers or scientists about the role of the humanities. Rather, I think of the art of Infowhelm as reproducing that experience of overload, but to offer ways to navigate data emotionally and experientially. And they also situate the Infowhelm experience in bodies and in histories. And as I said, I'm going to return to thinking about climate emotions later in my talk today, but I want to underscore that while ours is not the first era of information overload, there's a specific flavor to it in the present that I thought it was very important for me to underscore in working on this for the book and subsequent work I've done. So the attributes I identify are that data are uncertain and evolving. They're contested by those in power, and the stakes of taking action are enormous. So that was a quick overview of the concept, but I want to talk about how it sort of gets, I mobilize it in the book Infowhelm. So these attributes really get their full contours when they come into literature and visual culture. Encountering information in these cultural works led to these guiding questions for my project. So how do the arts take up environmental information? What happens to it when it enters art? How do the arts generate knowledge? And what theories of knowledge do they offer, especially as companions to the sciences rather than rejections of the sciences? And in asking these questions, I'm really thinking of art and treating art as an active mode of knowledge making. So environmental artists don't just document the experience of overwhelm. As I mentioned earlier, they turn it into a resource for thinking through how we come to know the environment. They tease out what epistemological authority the arts hold in relation to the sciences. And I want to pause also on how I use information in the project. I'm really certainly thinking about it in terms of quantitative data, but also the methods to use to collect and analyze data and scientific explanations and concepts. So these questions and ideas arose as I took in contemporary fiction films and visual culture and really noted the abundance of environmental information they contain. And so one example, I'm not going to do any in-depth readings, but one example that really threads through Infowhelm, sorry about that, is the work of Juliana Spar, a kind of experimental poet. And here's, I just included a page from her poem, Unnamed Dragonfly Species, and that appeared in her volume, Well Then There Now, from 2011. So as I said, Spar's poetry really runs as a leitmotif through and a roadmap for Infowhelm. It appears in the prefaces to the 3 parts to really set up some key questions for each one. And what you'll note here is it's a prose poem. The sentences are interrupted by these bold names of animals that appear on the endangered or threatened species list for New York. There's also a collective speaker who doesn't quite appear in the, it just appears in the first line in this screenshot of the page. And what happens in this poem is that it dramatizes the stings of climate data that are encountered when we enter the rabbit hole of the internet, exploring climate information. But it also offers strategies for soothing or numbing those stings, and it offers a take on really the emotional intricacy of environmental information, that cocktail of emotions that I mentioned earlier. It expresses the intimacy of information and experience, embodiment and feeling. So it's certainly, the aesthetic Infowhelm certainly crops up in poetry, like this example here, and I talk about novels predominantly in the rest of the literary portion of Infowhelm. But it also appears in films, and especially like as a form of mise-en-scène. So we have here First Reformed by Paul Schrader, and I have the arrow pointing to that. It certainly appears in eco-documentaries inspired by Inconvenient Truth. It appears in the epistemological conflicts that are depicted in the documentary Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. And as I continued to encounter the Infowhelm in environmental culture, I identified three themes, three ways I thought I could organize the way it's appearing in cultural works. So climate data processing. So basically how we would have characters encountering and us as audiences to say data visualizations, encountering climate data and basically turning into data processors ourselves. It appears as the new natural history. And finally, the last section is on aerial environmentalisms. And I just note here that the image on the screen is from Laura Kurgan's monochrome landscapes, and she's coming virtually, I guess, to IHC in April. So I'm happy to talk through some of the examples from these different parts of the book in our conversation, but I want to wrap up this section on Infowhelm by just thinking about why does it matter, right? So the first takeaway from the project is perhaps obvious, and I've mentioned it earlier, that information is the raw material for art today. It really constitutes the aesthetic form. It's not just an afterthought. Another key takeaway for me is that artistic form and mediation are crucial to knowledge production. So we come to know issues like climate change through formal conventions and genres like horror or techniques like the aerial. But beyond this, the arts of Infowhelm also reflect on all the mediations of information and how they shape environmental understanding. And these I've listed on the slides are just some of the ways that I really think of the mediatedness of information as I'm analyzing the various cultural works. So things like power, scientific values, aesthetic form, as I mentioned a moment ago, emotion, history, including technological history, and social and identity positions. And I think I wanted to underscore this because the humanities are well equipped really to think about the ways to understand these forms of mediation. It's one of, I think, the contributions the humanities bring is bringing these lenses, right, to scientific representation and discourse. And the arts are practicing them. So we see that sort of convergence of art, science, and humanities by looking at data representation. And finally, another takeaway for the project is that environmental values form in this crucible of mediation. They don't form in a vacuum. So it's crucial to our ways of knowing, our epistemological positions. And this leads to a key word for my project, which is entangled epistemologies. So the arts are especially good at bringing together domains of knowledge that would typically be isolated by discipline, tradition, and identity. They're also good at reproducing or challenging epistemologies behind environmental thought. And these often have their roots in colonialism, racist, and sexist practices. So in my usage, entangled epistemologies is really capturing how the arts integrate varied ways of knowing by staging these encounters with scientific information. And Euro-Western science presents the facts of environmental damage, but artistic representations can really mingle science with these ways of knowing rooted in emotion, embodiment, uncertainty, self-reflexivity, and speculation as well. So what I find is that the artists, and I also look at some activist work, they repurpose the data and methods of Western technoscience, but not to acquiesce to it. Instead, they do so to provide some historical awareness of how that world has been made, and in some cases to speculate on possibilities for making it otherwise. And integrating ways of knowing, I argue, the arts are going beyond communicating stories about crises. They instead are overhauling perception, feeling, and thought, which really is the crucial foundation for environmental positions. And I argue that without new ways of thinking, and this is inspired by comment by Donna Haraway, without new ways of thinking, new relations are impossible. And with that point, I'm really in conversation and learning from Indigenous environmental studies, Black and feminist science studies, thinkers and activists who really champion those epistemologies rooted in speculation and identity, storytelling, and the sensing and feeling body. And here are just some of the fellow travelers who like informed the book or appear in it. So I'm going to just pause for a second there as I transition to the second part of my talk, where I want to take these points about how the arts of the Infowhelm are really declaring that knowledge is meaningless if it doesn't undergo this entanglement that renders it meaningful. So managing climate data isn't merely an academic exercise, of course. It's life and death for many, and less dramatically, it's an issue of how we encounter and process science and data are part of the emotional texture of life. Climate grief and loss are undoubtedly part of this texture, but so are joy, gratitude, and community. So Infowhelm, my book, includes Lynn's and James's projects as part of that section on the new natural history. And they are really registering and managing loss as well as memory in the case of what is missing, and gratitude and community. Akin to other artworks in this mode, these visualizations revive natural history's methods of classification, collection, and display, but not out of nostalgic yearning for the past, another common climate emotion. They're also not unleashing a kind of zombie enlightenment. These projects rework naturalist epistemologies to salvage a future out of the past. They really want to accommodate, contain, and sometimes even diminish emotions of loss. So these projects are capturing a phenomenon that has become even more vocal since I wrote the book, and that is the effect of climate emotions. So here's a smattering of headlines from the past 5 years and one tweet, including one from this fall, where noting that campuses are offering therapy for climate stress. These emotions often arise from TMI, and public discourse typically focuses on ways to mitigate that onslaught. So they might say, take a break from screens or go out on a walk with friends, get good sleep hygiene, things like this, find support with community or through therapy and activism, which are all really wise forms of counsel that I, and I'm sure many of you, have followed. But today I want to consider how the environmental arts and academics might be contributing to this climate TMI. The arts and humanities, we certainly contextualize the feelings that arise around information overload from climate crisis. So you have projects, as I mentioned, like Lynn's What is Missing, which offer a space to collect those feelings along with the stories of creatures and phenomena that contributors really feel protection, care, and love, and maybe nostalgia for, and on which they might also depend. Another example of a project that's really offering space to collect those feelings is one called Dear Climate. So, and this does not appear in the book. Dear Climate uses the intimate form of the letter. It also has like posters that kind of look like broadsides, meditations you can listen to, but the letter form really speaks back to the climate and the beings, most often humans, who are altering it. So this Dear Climate was originally a collaboration of Una Chowdhury, Marina Zurkow, Fritzl Ertl, and Oliver Kellhammer. And it uses public media, as I mentioned, such as broadsides and wayfaring signs to, in their words, lead viewers and listeners toward a better informed, more realistic, and more affectionate relationship to the more than human world, including geophysical forces and other species. A kindred project that's thinking about like addressing climate as a way to express the emotions of it is Greeting Cards for the Anthropocene, which is actually based at the University of Texas. Craig Campbell is the leader of it with his intermedia workshop. And this also employs the first person genre of the letter, and the greeting card in particular. It often has these imperative genres that we see in the poster and on signage to give voice to feeling and action. So affection might turn to a directive to love or respect the creatures with which we cohabit, but other climate feelings like hurt and anger might raise the question, as we see here in Dear Climate, the climate's changing, shouldn't we? As Campbell notes for greeting cards for the Anthropocene, even if these missives, quote, cannot halt climate disaster, their creation and dissemination can be part of efforts to sustain community. So the arts, or in some of these cases, research creative practice, as many would prefer, as I mentioned, they provide containers, conduits, and spaces for reflection for environmental feelings. And I think that the humanities, like working in these forms, working with the arts, intervene in climate emotions in these ways as well. And additionally, the humanities really contextualize the long history of those feelings and how specific conditions ignite them. So Indigenous and Black studies scholars adamantly remind environmental humanists that for the, quote, we inhabiting identities of Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, eco-social apocalypses came long ago. They came with genocidal and ecocidal colonialization by white Europeans and with the global slave trade by the same. And Amitav Ghosh's recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, really narrates this long history. The book opens with the question, quote, how must it feel to find yourself face to face with someone who has made it clear that he has the power to bring your world to an end and has every intention of doing so? The someone in this quotation is a Dutch official working under the auspices of empire. These early capitalists came to the Banda Archipelago, part of what's now Indonesia, which is really the history that Ghosh is examining. And they came to raise the villages and expel and exterminate the residents and extract valuable nutmeg, cloves, and mace, all of that to spice the cuisine, cure the ills, and fund the rapacity of Western empire. Ghosh's tale of this seasoned curse places present climate crisis at the, quote, and this is a quote by a review, or of a review of the book by Ben Ehrenreich, but it places climate crisis, quote, at the converging axes of colonial conquest and capitalist extraction that continue to define our world. So the humanities, along with the arts, insist that the question, how does it feel, right, reaches back centuries at these converging axes. Answers to this question, how does it feel, voice experiences in notes and tones specific to places and peoples and times. So these acts of contextualizing, containing, delivering, and shaping climate motions are really the pillars of the arts and humanities. But I also, with the rest of my time, want to think about, as I mentioned in my opening, sort of the responsibility for Clyde TMI that we might find in the arts and humanities. And so to think through this, I'm going to switch gears and go back or forward. Haven't talked much about climate fiction, but to climate fiction. And these remarks actually originated in casual or pleasure reading over the holiday period between like Thanksgiving and sometime in January. And casual or pleasure reading is kind of a misnomer when you're a contemporary lit scholar, because you always sort of have your antennae up for trends and currents, even if you don't have a pen in your hand. But I was reading them out of curiosity and not like for the purpose of this talk or an article or something like that. And it was these three big novels, and I'll be talking in this section about the atmospherics of climate crisis. But it was these three big novels, Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land, Annie Proulx's Barkskins, and Hanya Yanagihara's To Paradise, which appeared between 2016 and 2022. And each of these really emphasized another way that the arts produce climate emotions, sometimes while contextualizing them. And that is, as I have here on the slide, by producing an atmospherics of climate crisis. So in Barkskins from 2016, the scenes of environmental ravage are present throughout its narrative, which spans 300 years. Readers can, present day readers can connect the dots from the mass deforestation she writes about in the European context and in the colonized Americas, and really how that is linked to what is happening today with present day extraction and climate impacts. But the novel doesn't leave that connection to chance. So I don't think there's a real spoiler here, but the novel ends with a chapter set in the 21st century, kind of we leap forward, where a character visits the Greenland glaciers and, quote, suffers a full force shock of recognition of the coming disappearance of a world believed immutable. In Yanagihara's 2022 To Paradise, we also get a multi-centennial span, which appears in all three of these novels. In that case, Yanagihara's case, it reaches from 1893 to 2093. And in that final section set in the nearish future, the temperature of New York City has become so unbearable that residents have to wear these cooling suits most of the year. And some of these are, quote, equipped with a, quote, full hardshell helmet with a pollutant filtering shield. Doors 2021, Cloud Cuckoo Land, begins on a timeline that is outside of the Gregorian calendar that we get in these other novels. We begin on a ship called the Argos, which is not so subtle, in mission year 65. Reading deeper into the novel and back in time, we learn this plot centers on a family that's part of a 600-year experiment to survive off-planet when climate crisis has made Earth uninhabitable. And I won't say any more about that because that would be a spoiler for that novel. None of these novels is like centrally about climate change. And I know that's a loose distinction, the aboutness of a novel. Be happy to talk about that or speculate on that in the conversation. But I just want you to go with me for now, thinking about how these novels aren't quite about climate change. Many such novels exist, and more by the day. And these are often about the possibilities for averting climate crisis, protesting it, or adapting and surviving it. So there's some of that, the adaptation and survival, of course, in Cloud Cuckoo Land and To Paradise, but it's really incidental to some other happenings. But the more like, I think, head-on climate crisis novels we might think of are Richard Powers' Overstory, or Sherry Demoline's The Marrow Thieves, Ruth Ozecki's The Book of Form and Emptiness, and Aaron Swan's Walk the Vanished Earth. These all came out within the last 5 years or so. We also have like HBO, BBC series Years and Years, and the recent Netflix satire Don't Look Up. In my holiday reading, though, climate crisis has become atmosphere, quite literally so in Yanagihara's novel, where people are wearing suits and helmets, and also in Door's novel To Survive It. In these contexts, climate data is becoming setting. Climate fiction is in many cases just a part of fiction. And in some ways that resonates with my points about how literature takes up scientific information and makes it the raw material of their work. But what I'm seeing here is like that raw material is sort of moving into the background. Amitav Ghosh's arguments about the inadequacies of climate narrative might still hold. Min Song, another scholar of climate literature, in his book Climate Lyricism, he might be correct that even a, quote, riveting climate novel like The Overstory is, in his words, disappointing and, quote, points to an endemic weakness in the genre. But the failures that Ghosh, Song, and others find in so much contemporary literature about the climate change aren't from a lack of trying. So I'm less interested in what becomes of that cli-fi or climate fiction designation as climate change becomes setting and in atmospherics. What concerns me is how cultural works go from managing TMI to producing it. So climate crisis atmospherics can still be spectacular. There's nothing subtle about planetary inhabitability, which we have in Dor and Yanagihara's novels. They spend a great deal of descriptive energy on the protective gear, especially that characters need to endure the changed air. But spectacularity isn't the same as centrality. So climate crisis is merely an inciting incident for plot development and the twists that produce narrative satisfactions. Or in the case of Barkskins, it's a coda, the outcome of this much longer plot of deforestation. And I'm not saying it doesn't make climate crisis any less present. Similarly, even if we don't register those headlines I mentioned at the start of this talk, or if we don't click through to the content, it's still present as an atmosphere to the day. And Jenny Offel's novel really thematizes this effect in her aptly titled Weather, a novel from 2020. In this novel, an unnamed writer mother manages the stresses of living with the knowledge of climate crisis rather than its more immediate impacts or dangers to health or tradition and livelihood. Materially, climate change only incrementally impacts her middle and creative class life in Brooklyn. And if the novel weren't so obsessed with crisis, we might call the narrators noticing a, quote, soft representation of climate change. And this is a phrase that Elizabeth Callaway has used for texts that, in her words, fold climate into the everyday lives of everyday people. In Weather, though, the soft hardens psychologically and emotionally. Climate change is a constant strain, source of anxiety, guilt, and anticipatory threat. To put a finer point on it, I'm saying that Weather thematizes that rendering atmospheric of climate data that I detect in my reading of a slew of other climate novels. One of the things that interests me about this atmospherics is how it reflects back on Ghosh's oft and even oversighted arguments about climate stories and the Great Derangement. So there, Ghosh makes a literary historical argument via Franco Moretti's arguments. Classic tales like the Iliad, Decameron, and Arabian Nights thrilled at, quote, exceptional or unlikely happenings. This was the stuff of stories. The Euro-Western novel of modernity, however, contains such happenings, but Ghosh relates, quote, what is distinctive about the form is precisely the concealment of those exceptional moments that serve as the motor of narrative, end quote. The normal takes the day in these novels of modernity, and it fills the book's pages. That is to say, in Moretti's words, the modern novel takes shape through, quote, the relocation of the unheard of toward the background, while the everyday moves into the foreground. Ghosh reads a 19th century novel by Bengali writer Bankim Chandra Chatterjee alongside Madame Bovary. And Ghosh concludes, quote, here then is the irony of the realist novel. The very gestures with which it conjures up reality are actually a concealment of the real. In the past 5 years or so, these categories of the exceptional and everyday have blurred in life and in fiction. In works creating that climate atmospherics, the formerly unheard of data of climate crisis are at once foreground and background. The exceptional that's now a constant force on economies, geopolitics, ecosystems, ways of being, and well-being are both muted and present. What interests me about this rendering of climate data as atmosphere is how it might contribute to emotional climates as well, and whether it makes climate almost overheard of instead of that unheard of in the text by Moretti and Ghosh. In climate lyricism, Minsong compares this effect to a refrigerator running in his house. His ears rarely pick up the hum of the evaporator as it competes with things like kids running around or a phone going off or radio blaring. Song asks, quote, "In the midst of so much noise, what kind of boost can the signals of climate change get so that attention doesn't disperse?" And he's interested in like the ways that poetry especially can cut through that noise. I want to dwell with the ways environmental narratives and the humanities can actually produce that noise. And I'll be looking here or reviving, I guess, some ideas for this piece I wrote for LitHub last year, Is Climate Writing Stuck? And in this piece, I identified these three micro conventions of climate writing I'd been noting for a few years, and I called these basically tics of climate writing. So they include the hopeful ending, the eco side aside, which is better in writing than when you have to say it, and then the catalog of despair. And in this article, I write that climate tics seem to slip out of the writer's pen or out of their fingers with less thought even than the common metaphors of climate crisis, like canary in the coal mine or game over for the planet. These tics are really indexing the inevitability of climate impacts and the stalemates of climate action. But these dispositions are often ones that the writers are trying to otherwise disavow or work against. And I'm seeing these tics in a new light after attending to climate atmospherics in my holiday reading. So especially the eco side aside and the catalog of despair, I think contribute to that atmospherics. And it really appears in a lot of, like, as I mentioned, artistic and humanistic thought. So the first of these, the aside, refers to moments where a text interrupts like the flow of a passage. And often this happens through like dashes or parentheses. And it's a moment where the narrator, the author, takes note of climate collapse. So all the creatures dead and dying really get a nod, while the rest of the story, having nothing to do with those deaths, often proceeds. So I won't read all of these, but I have a few examples. One is from Ben Lerner's The Topeka School, a novel from 2019. And in this moment, this is the first quotation here, the narrator flees the Metropolitan Museum as he's on an acid trip and it just starts to turn bad. And he ends up at the Central Park Zoo. And so a memory of a past visit intervenes. And there's this parenthetical aside, the animals laughing at my plight. And then the dashes, although since that afternoon in 1969, over half of the world's animals have disappeared. And we have just another couple quotations, again, where not really about what's happening in the narrative, but you have these mentions of a lot of animal, especially animal death. I read these asides as non-committal and sometimes even dismissive. They might identify the author or character as aware of the realities of climate crisis. And as I wrote in that piece, it can also work as a kind of detox or, an outlet for all this poisonous, if true, information. The catalog of despair is really is like a cousin to the aside, and it is usually a longer list. It's not usually relegated to the parenthetical. They're often prefaced by the trope of the meanwhile. So like, while you're reading this book, X, Y, or Z is happening. And this occurs really vividly in Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. She writes, quote, "There's tremendous devastation now. In the time it takes you to read this book, acres of rainforest will vanish, a species will go extinct. People will be raped, killed, dispossessed, die of easily preventable diseases." We see this in Anne McClintock's lyric essay, Monster, A Fugue in Fire and Ice. And this also has another formal signature of these catalogs, which is often staccato sentences, sometimes fragments. So I won't read this one, but it's on the slide for those of you who wish to look at it. And I argued in the essay that environmental writers, and including myself, I do not exempt myself from having these tendencies, we rely on them, and they become gestures that at once feel disposable and insignificant, yet are really carrying the weight of these planetary and social upheavals. I argue or speculate, think about how they can actually be a strange sort of comfort when other paths forward feel elusive or blocked. We can be ensnared in the stalemates of climate action. And these climate ticks, they really don't gnaw through those snares, but provide some reassurance of or assurance of the familiar. And that's where I think they can encode inevitability, even if the writer is trying to think their way out of the inevitable. And I want to be clear, I'm not assigning like pass-fail verdicts on texts or those who use these techniques. I don't think they're bad or that the writing disappoints. I'm much more interested in how they are barometers of states of mind. And that's a phrase I used in that article that now is really resonating for me as I think of this like atmospherics of climate data. So they are indicators as important as the overt visions and policies on offer. And climate narratives are both, I think, recording and producing CLI-TMI, and the arts and environmental arts and humanities contribute to this phenomenon in those two senses of contribute. So the one sense, they contribute in the academic sense of providing containers, conduits, and spaces of reflection by contextualizing the long history and specific conditions shaping information and feeling. But I think we also contribute to CLI-TMI in the other sense of producing it ourselves by rendering climate information atmospheric through these ticks and other devices. And so I don't see this as a failure, as I said, but as the IHC and any of us who want to think about these things, as we continue to provide occasions for thinking through too much information, I encourage us not to only point to it out there, as it were, but to consider our responsibility for producing the condition as we interpret and register it. For me, as an environmental scholar and teacher, but also someone involved in policymaking here in Austin, I'm thinking about how much I am turning the unheard of into the overheard of. And as I consider the issues surrounding this CLI-TMI, I think back to my point from Infowhelm that art is an active mode of knowledge making. And I wonder, as climate data becomes atmospheric, does knowledge become more passive? Does it cease to coalesce into knowledge at all? We want to create buzz in the sense of making climate action unignorable for businesses and government leaders, but we don't want that buzz to become the hum of a refrigerator or simply the signal of climate wokeness. So thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much. My mind is spinning and going and thinking, as I'm sure our audience members' minds are as well. That was so interesting. Let me try to formulate a question. There are two questions, but they're related. The first version is this. It strikes me that as you talk about the way in which, or talk about the climate ticks that are in a way, what I would call, and please correct my language, a kind of domestication of something that you are arguing needs to remain far less manageable. On the one hand, climate literature is producing knowledge, which is, it has its epistemological function. On the other hand, there's a danger of becoming the refrigerator hum. And it's so if I just sort of as a very simple
Yes,
iteration.
yeah.
So what strikes me is that this is a kind of new instantiation of the arguments about representing not the unthinkable, but the unrepresentable, especially, for example, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. There was a question about how do you represent atrocity without, in fact, negating memory. So this was a question of memory. And that sort of is the, that's Adorno's aesthetics. How do you represent without negating, domesticating, rendering sort of further oblivious? Okay. That said, my question, or rephrasing of this question, is how do you see paths forward beyond or around climate tics? And what would a barometer of a successful approach or aesthetic practice be for you?
Yeah, and this is why I thank you for that. It was a very good summary, and I think the comparison of representing the unrepresentable or aestheticizing. I mean, that's another question that comes up, especially, I mean, certainly when you work on Holocaust representation literature, and certainly when you work on depictions of environmental catastrophe, damage, and a host of other things that represent violence and pain for so many people. Is how do you not just aestheticize, right, the violence and the pain? So I think those are also really good lineages and traditions of thought to tap into. The question of a successful, I mean, that's one of the tricky things. I think a line I'm trying, or a path I'm trying to navigate unsuccessfully, I think, because I do have a problem with those pass fail verdicts. Like I'm not interested in saying that is bad, that there's a right way. I don't know the right way, right, to represent climate issues necessarily. But I don't think I'm navigating that well, because I'm certainly seeing, some problems with the way, or at least identifying some of these potential problems with the way climate representation occurs. But to not dodge your question, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is one of the reasons I want to bring up this sort of becoming atmosphere, becoming setting, these tics, is I really do think they've become something that we rely on. And I want to interrogate that as like thinkers and artists. Why are certain things kind of reassuring, even if what we're getting at is something maybe where reassurance isn't possible, right? So I think the first step for me is noticing, of course, and that's what a lot of my remarks today in the second half were about, is like so many we've noticed, right, the doom and gloom narrative. Like we've noticed the horror narrative. We've noticed like relying on the family as a source of like comfort or as an anchor for some of these climate narratives. We've noted, also the how white voices, for example, can dominate, and characters can dominate these narratives. So one of the steps is really this noticing and thinking about really asking the question of like, is reassurance necessary, and what the alternatives would be. Like if it's not, because these aren't reassuring in the sense of saying like, it's not a problem, we'll all survive, there's an easy way out, there's a techno fix. It's somehow much more deeply ingrained in our ways of talking. And so maybe I am still dodging your question, because I'm not exactly sure, if eliminating, say, the catalog of despair is going to lead to climate action, for example. But I think it can register maybe a level of inevitability that the rest of the text is not espousing. You know, what I find is interesting is that tension between like, you know, I want to think my way out of the inevitable, but I'm relying on these things that make it very much make it sound like it is. So do we, you know, what work are those contradictions doing for us as writers, readers, and what other approaches?
Thank you. All right, I am going to start off with a question from our audience. It is a literary scholar speaking, a colleague of mine, Sarah Weld, and she has written a narrative question. It's rather long, but I'm going to read it in toto because it's coherent. And so just here it goes. All right. She starts with some musings. I have sometimes wondered whether in truly existential mental circumstances, perhaps the ones that trigger very strong emotions, or even perhaps fight or flight responses within us, human beings fail to understand quantitative data system error can't compute. Examples include genetic testing or a medical prognosis where the negative possibility overwhelms all reason or rationality. Might climate data be similar in this sense? So it shuts down our rational processing systems so that one is forced into flight mode rather than fight mode, because as you show, the threatening data is overwhelming. We turn into our tiny mouse-like ancestors cowering underground helplessly, watching the apocalypse come for the dinosaurs while we hope we will survive in our hidey holes. Except in this case, the apocalypse is of our own making. All right, you have the question in there?
Yes,
These sort of climate data and trauma and return.
Yeah. Fortunately, I have the text in front of me, which is helpful,
good.
which you don't always, you know, get in the live talk typically. I think it is similar, and I'm not just thinking. I think a lot of psychologists, sociologists have thought about that, like thinking about why, despite the preponderance of information and in contexts where people are not skeptics or deniers or trying to think of, you know, maybe just simply a technological solution, a simplistic kind of technological solution, even in those cases, it's very easy to avert one's eyes. And I think this is probably the mechanism that people would refer to, right? That what can we do with it? And I think that is like, what can we do with that information, especially in the moment in which we receive it, right? It's often, and that's one of the things that interests me with Infowhelm, is how the moments when we receive it are not necessarily moments when we're seeking it, right? Like maybe you look at headlines specifically to learn about the latest climate science or impacts, but often it's coming to us in moments when we're doing other things and our minds are elsewhere. So, I mean, that's why I think sometimes we don't even register it at a really conscious level. And I saw the question about the unconscious down below, but even in the moments when we do, that fight or flight response is very strong. So I do think climate data falls into that bucket. And I do think, like, there's another novel, probably many of you interested in climate fiction have read, called Lydia Millett, called The Children's Bible. And what you see is kind of like you have these families that have come together in this vacation house. A huge storm comes in. The house is basically being flooded and social systems and infrastructures collapsing all around them outside of the house. And you sort of see, I don't know if it's flight exactly, but certainly hiding in a hidey hole is what happens to the parents. They've been drinking and doing drugs and having sex and kind of just having a merry vacation. And that only intensifies as they are facing not even the climate data, but the actual event happening around them. So I think, like, in that case, flight is like toward pleasure, and really distraction from the emergency at hand, but you're seeing certainly climate narratives play out those responses as well.
Thank you. All right. Another audience member writes, I'm in the midst of reading The Ministry for the Future, and I have tried to use its catalog of despair characteristics as a way to inspire deniers in my personal circles. Sometimes people argue that these extreme circumstances make them less willing to trust data because people take it to the extremes. The question is, are novels and art like this only helpful for people who already care about the climate?
Yeah, I think the age-old preaching to the choir question is a really good one. And this came up, I think, also. I mean, another question one might have, Kim Stanley Robinson is certainly a major figure. A lot of people, will rush out to read his novels, but still the reading public can be a lot smaller than like the Netflix streaming public. So this question definitely came up for Don't Look Up, the satire. There was a lot of buzz around that film when it came out of like, is the satire only, I think, satisfying a sort of a very informed public who already thinks that climate crisis is imminent, happening, going to get worse? Or would that satirical angle, and the same for this show, Years and Years, BBC HBO show, does that really work on an audience that's not so concerned about the issue? And I think, that's one of the reasons, if I wanted to counter my thesis here, or explorations here, is as climate data and crisis gets more woven into the fabric of all forms of cultural representation, you're not really preaching to the choir necessarily, because it's just going to be there. And that's the same, I think, with these asides, especially that I mentioned. Those asides can appear, I'm not going to be able to have any good specific examples, but if you tune your ear to these things as you're watching a TV show, like even a sitcom or a rom-com, there can just be an aside like, well, the world's going to end in a year anyway, right? And it's like, well, so it's getting more woven into the fabric, where you're not just preaching, to mix all sorts of metaphors, not just preaching to the choir, but I think then the question would be, okay, you're reaching more people, but is it a dismissive gesture, right? That's not really encouraging someone to think about ways to avoid that inevitability, but really just reinforcing an inevitability. So I again, not an easy answer to this, but I think that is the question of like reaching broader audiences is at the heart of this, climate becoming atmospheric, that there's, on the one hand, you're reaching more audiences. On the other hand, is it like one of these dismissive or kind of reassuring gestures, or is it getting deeper, right, into people's reactive responses?
All right. Would it be fair to suggest that your argument is a kind of complementary counterpoint to Mark Bould's The Anthropocene Unconscious, with its emphasis on recognizing how deeply and constantly climate destruction is shaping contemporary narratives, even when it does so more subtly? And
I would say, so I have not read that book, so I will be very honest there, but your description, I mean, I'm curious how it's a counterpoint, since it sounds much more complementary than counterpoint to it. This is where the lack of live response maybe is hard, but I could do a quick Google search, but don't want to distract myself. But it does, I mean, as I was writing this, somewhat the LitHub article, I was wondering about it as like, I mean, there's the ideas of the unconscious or the symptomatic, like all of those, like there was certainly a kind of psychoanalytic angle I think one could take on this, and perhaps that is the angle of this book, and I'd be curious to see, how psychoanalytic the idea of the unconscious is in that book. It's not a discourse I'm deeply involved in anymore. But I think it would be interesting to bring that lens to these effects. And it kind of reminds me of the first question, thinking about some of these either psychological or psychoanalytic mechanisms, I think is a way to get purchase on what I'm calling like tics or atmospherics. So I'll just have to look into that. I don't have a good answer except for I will pursue it.
Okay. Well, what do you think about this characterization of, namely, scientists who are comfortable with data and capable of finding solutions and seem to react calmly, overly calmly, as the climate crisis bears down on us, on the one hand, so scientists reacting calmly and comfortably with data, and on the other hand, humanists and the humanities, which are loudly raising the alarm, but only have the tools to communicate about it. Again, there's a kind of opposition within an opposition. Is it true that the humanities tools are only communicative? But anyway, so what do you think about that opposition, the sort of loudly sounding alarms of the humanists and the calm approach of the scientists who can find solutions, but they're overly calm, according to this opposition?
Yeah. So there have been one of my slides, I actually had a screenshot of a tweet that was from the AGU conference, and there were protests. There was a lot of brouhaha around this. I'm not going to rehearse the whole incident, but it was from the AGU conference. It was a bunch of climate scientists sitting outside, and the tweet was about scientists sort of registering their grief. I had to look up the phrase because it was escaping me, but there was a headline today, and it came out of a think tank. So a policy think tank. I'm not sure how like hard science it is, but the headline said, "The world is at risk of descending into a climate doom loop, a think tank report has warned." So doom loop is the think tank's terminology. And so what we are seeing, and there have been people writing about this, including a lot of scientists writing about this, is like the dispassionate, I am reporting what the data shows, I am reporting, communicating hypotheses, findings, I'm not weighing in either politically or emotionally. That is dissipating very slowly, I think, right? And part of it is and this connects quite a bit to the Infowhelm project, is thinking about the epistemological values that the Euro-Western sciences have held on to. We think of things like quantification, objectivity, universality, but also being more dispassionate is one of those values. So that has very deep roots. The book Objectivity by Daston and Gallison is great for thinking about these, and their phrase epistemic values as one. I'm borrowing it from them, but that's a deeply rooted thing that is being deracinated with climate crisis, among other things. So yes, that exists, but I think it's also changing a lot. On the other hand, so the other half of the question, humanities are loudly raising the alarm, but have only the tools to communicate about it. I don't think we only have the tools. I mean, I think I hope my, efforts to look at how data enters cultural representations, it's certainly communicating about it, but also encouraging us to bring some of these epistemological modes of like speculation, of self-reflexivity, of even uncertainty into some of the scientific conversations. Not that they don't exist there at all, but so I don't think it has to only be communicating. And I guess I don't know time, I'm checking the time quickly. I worked on the climate equity plan for the city of Austin, and I'm now on a city commission that's implementing the plan. And I think those are contexts in which humanist perspectives go beyond like communicating the alarm of climate. Everyone in those rooms is alarmed, I can tell you. But as one of the I often say I'm waving my humanities hands. So like in that context, waving my humanities hands, it can be like asking some of those historical contextualization questions about how identity and impacts intersect. I mean, I don't think the humanities have to simply be communicating alarm, but can actually, in those conversations, do some of that work I mentioned they are doing in my remarks today. But I do think we're seeing like maybe more humanistic receptivity to emotion, and more like interest in the work that data does coming together rather than, this separation that's been entrenched.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your thinking and your insights. I think that your own thinking about the atmospheric liabilities is itself a kind of intervention to break the aura and return us to a different, I mean, not to destroy or dismiss, but just to complicate the conversation by turning a gaze on really ourselves as readers and how we fall under certain complacencies potentially, or the dangers of that. So thank you for this really generative, wonderful work. And thank you, audience members, for attending. We'd appreciate it if you would fill out our post-event survey. It just takes a minute. You can provide feedback to us. You can sign up for our mailing list so that you'll get information about our future events at the IHC. So have a good evening, and see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan.